Okay, here we go. Two online notes. I hope you guys had a lovely prom, and I think you'll find that we know a lot of the information that's going to be on the following notes. So let's do it. All right, so 6.6, the struggle for equal rights. Who do you think when we talk about equal rights? Two groups come to my mind, women and African Americans, but other minorities are there too. Let's talk about women first. Do you remember learning about the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848? Did you learn that in U.S. history? It's kind of the first time women got together and said that they deserved equal representation and rights in the United States. And for a long time, though, this was just a struggle happening in the background, and not a lot of progress was made until the 19th Amendment was passed in 1920, when women gained the right to vote. All right, we had a second feminist wave from 1960 until today. And this reminds me of U.S. history when I talked about Betty Friedan, and she wrote a book called The Feminine Mystique, and she kind of described how women have been kind of pushed to the side and forced to take a backseat to their husbands. And a lot of women read that book and it opened their eyes about their position. It made them more active. And we've seen groups like NOW rise up and fight for equal rights. What are some laws that have been passed in regards to women? In 1963, this is bold here, the Equal Pay Act was passed that said that employers needed to pay the same wages to men and women if it's at the same position. Of course, this is still an issue today. There is a difference in the overall annual income of men and women in the same positions. You could argue that that has a little bit to do with women having babies and women going on maternity leave when men don't have to do that kind of thing. But still, there's wage differences today in the United States. If you see on paper the Equal Pay Act of 1963, you need to be able to associate that with women. A part of the Civil Rights Act, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, prohibited employment discrimination on the basis of sex. So you could not refuse to hire a woman just because she was a woman and you wanted a man instead. I think I've talked in class before about the Equal Rights Amendment. Write it down. Equal Rights Amendment. This was an amendment that was to be passed and added to the Constitution that would say straight up men and women are completely equal in all ways. And ironically, from what I understand, a lot of women turned against this idea as they started to realize that that might mean being drafted into the army, and losing, some of those privileges. I don't know, you might call it a privilege to not have to be drafted in the army. So it was a lot of women that actually would turn against the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment. So that was never passed, the Equal Rights Amendment. Still, I think groups are trying to pass it today. Then there's Title IX of the Education Act of 1972. You absolutely need to know this. When you hear, so Title IX is like a part. Anytime I say title, that means like a portion, or art. It's kind of like article. Title IX said that you cannot practice gender discrimination in any kind of federally paid for thing. So that includes schools, and I talked about this with like the baseball team. You'll need to have a softball team. Oh my gosh, the Red Cross just called me again. Stop calling me. I gave you my blood. What more do you want? Okay. So Title IX of the Education Act of 1972 says that if you have federal money given to programs like a baseball team or a football team at Roosevelt, you need to spend an equal amount of money and offer the same opportunities to women in the school, to girls in the school. And I often think of school athletics, but this applied to lots of different things. All right, what are some cases that had to do with women? We have Reed versus Reed in 1971, in which the court ruled against doing arbitrary gender-based discrimination. They said that was a violation of the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. We have Roe v. Wade. This is bold. This is when the courts decided that it was constitutional for a woman to get an abortion as her part of her right to privacy. And women have seen success in electoral politics now. One question we've seen on previous tests is that in 1992, lots and lots of women were elected to Congress, and that was kind of called the Year of the Woman. But still, we see a gap, and there's not as many women elected as there are men. We've seen the power of soccer moms, or Million Mom March, or Moms Against Drunk Driving, or Security Moms. So women's voices are getting stronger and more powerful and louder. Today on the Supreme Court, we have 3 female Supreme Court justices. Can you name them all? Boom, 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 boom. There's Sonia Sotomayor. There's Alina Kagan. Those are two appointed by Obama. And then there is the old lady Ruth Ginsburg. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who's also on there. So you have 3 out of the 9 judges are women. That's kind of cool. And we still have active feminist groups. Let's move on to talking about African Americans, blacks. Okay, they make up 13% of the population. Back in 1857, we had the Dred Scott decision. The Dred Scott decision was a slave who happened to be a slave in a slave state, and then his master took him to a non-slave state, and he sued for his freedom. He said, I am now in a free state and I deserve my freedom. And he lost the case in federal court, and it said that slaves were not citizens. You should know the Dred Scott decision, 1857, happened before the Civil War, angered a lot of Northerners, said that slaves were not citizens and therefore could not do things like sue for their freedom, even if they were in a free state. Can you imagine how crazy that is? Doesn't that sound like if I have a bunch of slaves and I live in the South, I can move to New York and they would still be slaves? Isn't that kind of ridiculous? After the Civil War, we had the Civil War Amendments, or the Reconstruction Amendments, 13, 14, 15, that gave rights to blacks to protect them against state governments. I believe 13 abolished slavery, 14 promised equal protection in the eyes of the law, and 15 promised the right to vote, I think. Am I right? Yeah, I think so. Okay. After the Civil War, we saw a rise in Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws are laws that allowed things like separate water fountains, separate bathrooms. You can't eat in this restaurant, or if you do eat in the restaurant, you can't sit at the counter. You have to go in the back entrance. That's a Jim Crow law. And those were kind of allowed in cases like Plessy v. Ferguson, where the guy rode the train car, and he was like 1/8 black, and he rode the train car. He tried to go into the white car, and they said, no, you can't. And basically, as long as you were offered your own separate one, as long as you were offered a black train car, you had to use the black train car. And they called that separate but equal, but we know that the black train car was not as good a quality as the white train car, so it wasn't really equal. Separate but equal was overturned with the Brown v. Board case in 1954 when they got rid of school segregation. All right. When I say de jure segregation, I'm talking about segregation by law. It was law then that schools be segregated by race. When I talk about the other type of segregation, gosh, what was it on our vocabulary list? De facto segregation. De facto segregation is like racism. It's like segregation by choice, or there's no law, but sometimes white people go to white schools because that happens to be where everybody lives. Because they chose to be that way, because they're kind of racist. They didn't want to live in a black neighborhood. In the 1950s and 60s, during the Martin Luther King time, nonviolent civil disobedience became popular. Think of African Americans sitting at the lunch tables, getting beaten up, mustard poured on their head, all that kind of stuff, but not throwing any punches themselves. And as we got into the 60s and 70s, we saw more violent riot type of stuff having to do with race. African Americans have seen success in electoral politics, especially at the local and state levels. When you have a city made up of a majority black people, they're going to vote for a black candidate. So we have seen success at the local and state level. It's getting better at the federal level. After all, who is our president? Barack Obama. He's half black, okay? So more blacks are voting, and as they vote more, their voice becomes more and more powerful, and white politicians start to take into account what they might need. It says here to talk about Prop 209 in California. There was backlash against race being considered in education at all, not just at college level, but anything. And California passed Proposition 209 that said we will not think of race when we think of education. We'll just do things the way that we want to do them. And eventually that was actually gotten rid of, but it passed, Proposition 209. You might wonder what I mean when I talk about race in school. Well, there is this thing called the achievement gap, and it's one thing that we really talk about in college when I was going to college to be a teacher. And what it's about is that typically, as sad as it might be, minorities do not tend to be as successful in school as white students, with the exception of Asian students. So whites and Asians typically test better than minorities, Hispanics, African Americans. And we're wondering, trying to analyze exactly why this is, that despite spending all kinds of money, doing all kinds of studies, there is this achievement gap between the two. Alright, moving on to Hispanics. They make up about 15% of the population. They're becoming the largest minority group, or they already have become the largest minority group. When I say Hispanics, I'm talking about Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, Cubans, Central Americans. Here's some of their key issues. Bilingualism. Schools need to take active steps to help students that do not speak English. Alright, we cannot just ignore them and throw them in an English language arts room and expect them to follow everything. So in California, if you come here and you don't know English, we will put you in a class that transitions you from your language, or basically start you off in very simple English and works you up to more complex English, so that eventually after a few years you can transition and be in a quote-unquote normal language arts classroom. How does this relate to government? Well, states must now provide bilingual ballots for areas that have a bunch of people that don't speak English. So even places like in Orange County or LA County that might have a high Asian population, they have to have ballots in whatever language it might be, Korean or Mandarin. Okay, immigration is always a big issue whenever you have guys running for president or elections. And neither party wants to anger Hispanics by taking a restrictive position on immigration, so some of them talk tougher than others. Republicans tend to talk tougher on immigration than Democrats. But neither one really wants to alienate them. As we see, President Bush, the recent Bush, George W. Bush, was actually pretty popular with Hispanics because he didn't necessarily practice really strict immigration policy. His brother, who's talking about running for president right now, is doing the same thing. He said when people come to this country as immigrants, they do it out of love, not because they're committing a crime. All right. In 2006, there were mass demonstrations all over the U.S. about immigration bills that were in Congress. You might remember the movie A Day Without a Mexican or A Day Without Immigrants. Whenever people, well, there's a movie, but also in real life, immigrants that day refused to kind of show up to work in order to show like what would it be like if you didn't have me around to, do the cheap jobs that you guys don't want to do. Then we talk about Asians. Asians are about 4% of the population. They're Chinese, Korean, Japanese, Filipinos, Southeast Asians, and South Asians. What do they care about? Well, immigration restriction in the past that's kind of been lifted. Of course, during World War II, we had Japanese American internment camps and refused to kind of admit that this was a bad thing until maybe Jimmy Carter or Bill Clinton's presidencies. We've barely paid any I think you got like $20,000 that was given out maybe under Clinton for whoever was still alive. There's been a bit of reverse discrimination in college admissions. And Asians are sometimes quote unquote the model minority because they assimilate perhaps better than other racial groups. Okay, let's finish off those notes. I'm going to break this up into two parts, so get ready for part 2, which is 6.7. Okay?